you for doing this. I think today's going to be a great conversation. We've already got some questions lined up, but before we dive into all this, tell everybody about who you are, your background, a bit of your professional journey, and a little bit about what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I have a PhD in marriage, couples, and family counseling, and I was licensed as a mental health counselor
Yep.
and a marriage and family therapist. And I retired in 2019. I was moving countries, and it just got to be a bit tricky to be online functioning as a therapist. So after I left my clinic, I was working freelancing as a therapist on my own, mostly online. And it just became really cumbersome, and I had to make some tough choices, and I decided to retire and just work as a coach instead.
Yeah.
And let my licenses go. And that was such a hard decision when I made that decision. But after transitioning and getting used to the idea, it really, I think, was the best thing for me to do because of some of my values clashing with the profession and
Yeah.
how things were evolving as well. So for me, I was able to prioritize my personal life, and that really was what was important to me, was to make sure that I stopped prioritizing my career and really started to make sure that I was in a good place and the things that mattered to me were in place in my life.
Yeah. I love it. I think that idea of self-care some can get wrapped up in, or we can see it as selfishness, especially as helpers, but it's really an issue of stewardship.
Yeah.
And so that's awesome. And we could probably do a whole podcast on, we won't get into this, but the state of our field right now, that's for a different conversation.
Yes.
So we've started doing some coaching as well. I'm still in the clinical piece.
Yeah.
But I love what you're doing. So let me dive in here, and I'm gonna just ask questions about relationships, maybe get into some conversations about masculinity and femininity, and then what I really want to do is point people to what you do, so they can connect with your resources. They can connect with you. I just think there's so much to offer. So, all right, question number one. We live in a pretty diverse relational landscape right now.
Mm-hmm.
And how do people define and navigate commitment, especially when there seems to be, and this may be an overstatement, but I'm going to overstate the point to make the point, an attack on monogamy. So how do we help people define and navigate commitment, especially in cultures that sort of like throw their noses up at monogamy?
Yeah, I almost feel like there's been a psyop, against monogamy that's been gradual and insidious over, gosh, a couple of decades now. But I don't, it's like there's so many things to say about this, but ultimately I feel people are confused about what is exclusive, what is an exclusive relationship, what is a committed relationship, what do you need in order to be married, because people are just sort of making up their own rules. Everything is so subjective, and monogamy is seen as constrictive,
Yeah.
limiting. And I think a lot of people have sort of internalized this messaging that they're getting from a lot of different sources out there in society and culture. But one of the main things I see as the problem is sort of the evolution of the dating world, right? Like, just if you look up the timeline of how things started, like pre-20th century, it was all courtship, right? And arranged, sort of informal arrangements, not like arranged marriages, but people would know people and there would be matchmaking and people would be courted as a dependent of their parents, right? And then they would
Yeah.
end up in a marriage situation. And then obviously in the early 20th century, like things started to shift a little bit with the influence of like Hollywood and just the cities and urbanism. And I think after the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s, obviously things took a much bigger jump towards more casual dating, sexual freedom, and equality between the genders. Obviously is a good thing, but there were some downsides to it too
Yeah.
that we've seen the effects of. And then like in the later 20th century and now in the 21st century, this technological sort of advancement with dating apps, the way that I see dating apps, and I'm not saying it's a like zero tolerance policy completely, but I really do not recommend people using dating apps because it makes it a lot more difficult to make genuine connections with people, meaningful marriage-minded connections, because the premise of dating apps embeds the idea that you're supposed to be casually dating multiple people at one time and you don't have to talk about it. Like you don't have to disclose that you're talking to all these other people. That's how they're built. That's their, their business model is to encourage people to have multiple people on a Rolodex, kind of spinning plates as they call it.
Yeah.
If you know that term.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No,
Keep going.
I'm curious to hear what you think because I think it's not a lot of people see it that way. So I'm curious as to what you think about dating apps and just if you feel like that's been a significant factor in people sort of being psyoped out of monogamy.
Well, I agree with you. I'm not, I don't have a bone to pick with dating apps per se, right? I understand what they're trying to do, but what I think happens with those, it is a symptom of our culture that we have divorced commitment and connection.
Mm-hmm.
Older generations value commitment. They'd stay married for 50 years and hate each other, but they didn't know how to foster connection. I think our generation values connection, but we don't know how to commit to each other. And so what the dating apps do is they allow for all of this connection, and the thrill momentarily without the anchoring of stability, of safety that is needed for healthy attachment, that's needed for healthy relationships. And so I think you need both.
Yes.
If you want to have good relationships, and I think that's in every, there's a lot of Greek words for love.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that those Greek words define love. I think they contextualize it. So my love for a friend, for example, might be different than my love for my wife, or is different from my love for my wife. There's similarities there, but I think Barbara Fredrickson, is a researcher out of North Carolina, has done some amazing research on love. And she says love is defined in three ways. It's when we create small moments of connection or micro moments of connection that foster shared positive emotions. And what that connection does is it starts to create a synchrony of biochemistry and behavior, oxytocin, vasopressin. You start to, couples start to sound alike, smell alike, it's like all these things. And then as there's a synchrony of those things, you foster belief of mutual care. I am for you and you are for me. And then that promotes the desire to then continue to create those micro connections. But in cultures where we're all about connection, I think it sabotages monogamy because it sabotages safety, commitment. So there's a marriage there, no pun intended, between the commitment and the connection piece that I think is really important. That gets lost sometimes in those dating apps and the way we do things. Thought on any of that?
Yeah, no, I think that, it's this immediate gratification, the sort of seeking pleasure. A lot of people are putting more importance on seeking pleasure, and they're not tolerant of discomfort, right?
Yeah.
They run away from anything difficult that comes up in a relationship, and there's that, to having too many options, FOMO, fear of missing out. So all of those sort of more modern or new current psychological challenges that we're seeing people face, I think it's really steering them towards these short-term relationships.
Yeah. What do you think about? Because I think that is the perfect soil for personality factors.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't wait around long enough in a relationship to see myself in the mirror of that relationship, to see the unhealthy parts of me, how I contribute to the problems in the relationship, just being able to write people off and just be me, and it seems to foster these defense mechanisms of idealization and devaluation, splitting. You're either all good or you're all bad. And I'm just going to write you off because there's nothing wrong. Yeah, I think it can foster that kind of stuff in our culture.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. The mental health crisis is definitely, I think, shot up a lot since all of these
Oh yeah,
have been planted in the soil. So
yeah.
I'm not in the mental health field anymore, but from what you're seeing, are you seeing a lot more problems than maybe 20 years ago?
Um, I don't know if I'd say many. What I'm seeing is a lot of relational induced anxiety because everybody wants the connection, but they live with the fear of being abandoned.
Mm.
And because they don't know how to ask the right questions, they don't know how to do this well and value commitment and connection. It's one of the reasons I was like, man, I got to talk with Taylor. We've got to get into some of this conversation. So, all right, new
Mhm.
question. Building on that, what are some? So let's keep picking on the online stuff for just a minute. What are some effective ways to navigate like online dating and social media platforms that actually create meaningful connection? So all of that's here, it's present. We know commitment and connection are important, but how do we foster meaningful connection and ensure the best results in this sort of, this digital dating world?
Sure. And this is, I didn't really get into before in my little intro about what I'm doing now, but I've really focused on prevention, right?
Yep.
Leaving the mental health field and marriage therapy. So now I'm really looking at helping people select their ideal partners. And not that there is a perfect person out there for anyone, but just that knowing yourself the best that you can, becoming more of your ideal self, approximating that, helps you determine who is the most compatible for you.
Yes.
And so the whole point of my vetting system is that you are clarifying what matters most to you, what you stand for, what your values are, who you want to be, the type of life that you are striving to create and build, and the legacy that's going to come on the other side of that, right?
Yeah, I love it.
All of that stuff, your goals, your needs, your boundaries, and just making sure that you're in a place where you are selecting someone intentionally. Because I think that, I mean, we're talking about online, but just generally, I think that the problem with the divorce rate and marriage success, the limitations there, is that people are just marrying too frivolously. So I actually want to reduce one of my in a way, a roundabout way, I'm just saying this because it's kind of ironic when you hear it. I want to reduce the incidence of marriage because I want the right people to marry.
Yeah.
And in doing so, the divorce rate is going to go down.
Yes.
So preserve and sanctify marriage as a lifelong commitment because the right people are marrying.
Yes. Man, I love it. So even from my own faith background, that resonates with me.
Mm.
It's why the pre-engagement, it's almost as if you're doing not premarital work, but even pre-engagement
Yeah.
work. And it doesn't start relationally. It starts with building a relationship with yourself.
100%.
That self-leadership piece.
Yes.
Um,
Online.
so yeah, so the online piece.
So
I love it. I've got tons of thoughts and questions about that, but we'll keep going and maybe come back to
yes, we should. I want to close this loop for you though. So online, people are hopefully starting to realize that social media, and not even just Instagram or the other competitive platforms, but just generally any kind of community that you use online. For instance, I had a client that is learning languages. So he's got a language app community, for instance, right? So whatever communities you're online in are becoming our organic but digital life neighborhood and community, right? The way we meet people and how we make connections.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important for us to use them in an appropriate way. So not just being frivolous and passive or unconscious about how we present ourselves or how we make connections, but actually using it in a way that you're almost leveraging the algorithm, because the algorithms are very smart and they will put people together. It's almost like assortive mating, right? It will help you assortively mate with people or connect with people who share your values and your interests and your lifestyle and all of that stuff. So if you can start to be more transparent and authentic and less about, just sort of showing what you think other people want to
Yeah.
see to attract everybody, because a lot of people are quantity over quality. And this idea is about being more true to yourself and focusing on attracting fewer people, but the quality people that share and align with you.
Yeah. Oh, so so much of this comes back to, and I'm going to say this again because I think it's really worth it. Self leadership, being self aware. If you don't want to put your authentic self out there, why?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on inside of you that's afraid to be rejected? But what I'm hearing you say is being rejected is a strong word. I'm not necessarily using this word in the clinical sense, but being rejected is actually a part of this process. Um, maybe this is a hot word too, but maybe discrimination in a positive way, because we need to be able to discriminate between healthy, not healthy, right for me, not right for me. Is that a fair statement?
I believe so. And you can use it in the negative to clarify that for people that may be watching, right? Like when you are indiscriminate with your connections, you are way too accessible,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yes. Yep.
So being discriminate in that pure way, not like in a prejudicial way, like in the way that, virtue signaling sort of dictates, but when you are able to discriminate and select and discern the right people who align with you, then you're going to have more like healthier
Yeah.
connections, better results.
Well, and from a clinical perspective, what I would tell people who are doing clinical work is keep doing that clinical work, particularly if you've had trauma in your past that has created an indiscriminate approach to relationships, right? Keep doing that work, but connect with you on what it means to actually foster health. Because
Mm-hmm.
what you seek first organizes the rest of your life. I got that from a guy named Bob Hemp. So shout out to Bob. But the idea is if I'm seeking first a solution to my problem first, my problem's still organizing my life. But if I seek first to know who I am, if I seek first to know the kind of relationships I want, what my mission is, what my values are, then I can deal with the pain of rejection in that process, but I'm able to foster a healthy discrimination to know, hey, I don't have to open myself up just for the quick fix and get wounded again. And so it's like, hey, keep doing that clinical work, but when they can connect with you to be able to lean into what health really looks like, to be able to foster that growth and steward that growth in great ways. Does
Yeah.
that resonate with you? Is that
Yes, and I do have one, and this kind of overlaps to the conversation we're deferring about the mental health field, but I have some clients who are also seeing therapists, and I have some clients who tell me about the difficulty they have with the opposite sex that they're vetting, who are seeing therapists. And interesting anecdotes come up because some therapists may not be as helpful, when someone is trying to do their trauma recovery work and explore all of those solutions. Sometimes they embed them further into ineffective coping skills that they're not helpful to creating healthy dynamics in a relationship. For instance, there was one example of I was speaking to a man. Most of my clients are male, but I do have some female clients. And he was vetting a woman who was in therapy dealing with her trauma. And because her trauma therapist it seems like, in effect, she was heavily influenced by feminism, right? Because as therapy, generally, mental health and counseling is heavily influenced by social justice work and feminism. She is more working towards independence in an avoidant way, like
yeah?
she's let her guard down or be more flexible and receptive to a healthy masculine man. And so I told him, I said, it's not about, blaming her for these red flags that she's displaying. Clearly they come from a trauma background, but you can't save her. You can't rescue her. She's already in therapy. Unfortunately, the therapist is not really aware of where she's leading this client, or maybe it's not the therapist's fault, but you know what I'm saying? Like, the therapy is not quite resolving this issue.
Yeah.
And so you just have to sort of empathize with her, but acknowledge and discriminate. They're not the right person for me because they're not open, they're not agreeable, they're not receptive to my values, and we're not a good fit.
You're exactly right. And we could, it might be interesting to do another Instagram live, or our podcast, My Well Lab, comes out November the 6th. Let's get on that podcast and have some conversations about therapists, because I really want to encourage, one of the things that therapists miss is that so much of therapy is individual, and so they miss the system that the person is in, and so they inadvertently coach people to take care of themselves in ways that actually mirror self-defense mechanisms, not healthy coping mechanisms. Does that make sense?
Totally. I'm with you.
Anyway. So, all right. So let me say this back to you about what I heard you say on the social piece. So basically, leverage the natural digital relationships and communities that you're in, because it's easier to connect with like-minded people if you know how to steward with intentionality the communities you're already in. I love it. That's gold, everybody. So.
And I've been doing some recently, somebody had a brilliant idea to create a panel that would review your dating and social media platform profiles. So there's 6 of us women on this panel, and so I've done 20 of them so far, which is pretty good in the last week or two. And they submit their profiles, like screenshots, and we just review them and give them feedback. And it's been really successful, and I really enjoyed it. But even with the social media profiles, it's so great. Like, my community, I talk about it a lot, so it's more prevalent and people are aware of the tips and the advice that I give them in order to create that kind of presence online. But the general public, the way that they present themselves is much more compartmentalized. Yeah. I think that is a very good word to describe it. And detached. Like, either it's too showy or it's too, like, hidden. And so there's this integration that I think people lack, and I help people find their sweet spot.
Yeah, that's great. Lean into the communities you're in, and reach out to Dr. Taylor for help if you need it. So let's say you're actually in a relationship. How do couples sort of balance those? So you're getting to know yourself, you get into a relationship, both people are relatively healthy, or they're at least moving in that direction. How do you balance individual goals, different interests, or just interests in general, different identities of who we are, all while sort of maintaining and pursuing a strong connected partnership?
Yeah, I think this is a really important conversation to have, because people, they often have challenges here because they didn't do the preemptive work, right?
Yes.
So people will often get sidetracked with these interests and hobbies on what I call the micro level, right? And so the core values are at the macro level. If you are vetting for someone for alignment on core values, then the specific ways that you manifest those values in your lifestyle through hobbies and interests may differ, and that's totally okay. Whereas a lot of people see these different hobbies or interests and they think that's incompatibility, right? That you don't share the same exact things. But if you think, like, zoom out and think on the macro level, you'll realize either they share the values that you do, that's important to you, or they don't. So the easiest one to talk about is health and fitness kind of thing, right? So you may both value health and fitness, but you express that differently, whether it's through the physical activities that you do or the types of foods that you specifically eat and that kind of thing. But as long as you both value health and fitness and optimizing all of that, then that's what truly matters.
Yes.
So I think that helps a lot, right? When you're already in the beginning looking for someone who fits those bigger values, and you're also open, like on the big five, you have higher scores in the openness, and you're at least moderate in agreeableness.
Right.
And then you're not going to be stuck on those specific behaviors that differ, and that allows you to then have that healthy time apart and have your individual preferences, but you still know that you align on what really matters. So I think that's part of it. What do you think?
I agree with you. One of the things that I do a lot is help people write mission statements, vision statements, and core values for themselves and their marriages. And then they think about how that plays itself out in their environment, how they engage the world around them. And I got this from Patrick Lencioni, but there's a massive difference between aspirational values and core values.
Yeah.
It is not a core value if you aren't willing to sacrifice or suffer for it.
True.
And so I think one of the reasons the vetting piece is so important is if somebody is not acknowledging who they are, they could align on values, big picture, but it's when you get into it, it's not a core value, it's an aspirational value. And they're not willing to give what you're willing to give for that.
That's what I usually refer to as like entitlement when I talk about entitlement, because if you do this exercise with people, like you do it sounds like very similar, but if you have them identify their core values, but then you ask them, how do you communicate those values in your life? How do you cultivate them? And they're like, well, I don't actually do this one. I'm like, well, you can't expect that of somebody else if it's not something that you embody or your own life. And so that awareness of like, oh my gosh, I need to do a lot of work on myself to make them actual core values, because right now they're aspirational and it reflects that entitlement in your dating practices.
So let me say this back to you, because I think I understand what you're saying. So basically, because I want to put my best foot forward, I incorporate all of my aspirational values into how I present myself, but I'm really not doing anything with them. And I would say, in that sense, a lot of times we're now operating from values like survival and comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Those have inadvertently become core values for us, because now I'm just trying to, I don't feel comfortable being authentic. So I'm going to pull this value, and and I'm going to present it as this is who I am. But really, I'm not doing my hands aren't in the soil of my own life in those areas.
Yeah. And I would add like ego and external value, right? Because, well, one, they're probably unconscious of it at the time, but if they're sort of talking to let's say a potential match, like a person they're connecting with, and they're saying, this is what I expect of you, right? This is what I value and what I'm looking for, but they don't realize they don't embody it, but they're acting entitled to it. It's because of ego, and because if you have it, then I have it because I have you, but they're not actually doing it themselves.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, God.
External control, I think, is probably the correct term.
Say that again.
It might be external locus of control too.
Yeah. Oh my God. We could just stop and hang out there for a minute, because that's not just romantic relationships. That's in what we demand from friendships. It's almost like a moralization where in order to protect myself, I'm going to set up these boundaries out here and use these values to protect myself. And it's okay if I don't live by them, but if you cross that boundary, it comes out as entitlement, ego. Wow, Taylor. Yeah.
There's a lot of that happening out there in the dating world.
It absolutely is. I know there's a context for this relationship, but I think that also fuels cultural projection. Like, we treat everybody like they're the bad guys, and we're unwilling to look at ourselves as the offender. And I know that's a hot word, but in our culture, but the reality of it is I have offended people. I've hurt people. I've said things to people. I've snapped at people. I don't like admitting that. I've been a terrible husband sometimes. Mel and I have been married 21 years, and it's like I have failed her at times. And I have to realize that if I don't take ownership for that offense, I am the offender in this, then I can slip into a victim mentality, which comes out as entitlement, as ego, and all those things. And it can really sabotage deeper longings of our heart for lifelong partnerships, marriages, and does that make sense? I'm just kind of thinking out loud. But.
And I think that, lack of accountability and people having just the sort of the knee-jerk response to defensiveness, like that being so prevalent out there and not being able to regulate their emotions, pause,
Yes.
Take responsibility for it's not even about always apologizing. A lot of people get this wrong. Like, you don't have to apologize like you're cowering in defeat, but you are acknowledging what you could have done differently or better for a better outcome. If you don't have the ability to do that, the humility to do that, then you're not relationship ready.
Yeah, you're right. There is a positive emotional health and maturity, and it can be lonely. If you really are pursuing health and you're willing to say, hey, I screwed this up, right? I failed you. I let you down. I did it. It's hard sometimes to get reciprocity there, which is why there's so much of I think it's one of the reasons why the vetting process is so important. Okay. So, let me ask you about gender roles here. So, with the changing cultural landscape again, I asked you about individual goals, interests, identities, and again, that so much of that starts with ourselves. It starts with that vetting process, healthy communication. How did gender roles? What role do they play in all this?
I know that's a rabbit hole, but I think in this context of what you're asking me, the first thing that comes to mind about how to be an individual but yet committed and how do gender roles play into that, I think of opposite sex relationships. That's the first thing that comes to mind to me, and it's a hot topic. I've talked about this frequently, and it's definitely something that gets people up and roar, but obviously it's going to depend on the couple, right? Like what your values are, and if you're in agreement, then great for you. But you do have to talk about these things, and you have to know what your relationship, I call it your relationship ethics. You can call it your relationship boundaries. And so agreeing to what those expectations are is really important. And a lot of people don't understand the boundary system around friendships for married or committed people because they think it's sexist. But there is an inherent acknowledgement of biology, right, that we need to take into consideration. And yes, we can overcome the biological drives by choice, but when you are in a committed relationship, in a marriage, then there are situations that you want to avoid, because what comes first and what's most important is that sacred union that you want to preserve and protect. And so if you have that healthy mindset about commitment, if you've really internalized it, then this is not about being sexist or, telling people what to like. It's not about control. It's about choice and about, committing to a decision about what's most important. So in my view of opposite sex friends, you can have opposite sex friends. It's not that you cannot, but it's how you have them is where it really matters, is how you have that. And if they're single and you're married, then you have to be even more careful about it. And so that means that you would include your spouse in interactions with the single let's just say it's a wife, and so you would include your husband with the single man, have some kind of friendship with them, whether it's based on work or a hobby or whatever. And I also encourage people to have group communication in general. Like if you have couples, like we have a double date a group chat with our friends, right? And so we all talk together. And so that can help clarify and prevent a lot of communication difficulties or, offline
Yeah.
triangulation. So it's just about being mindful of how to respect each person's spouse or partner and to acknowledge that if you're spending one-to-one time with a single person of the opposite sex, I mean, generally the context would be you're heterosexual and you're spending time with the opposite sex one-to-one, unless it is framed for a particular purpose, and if it's just social, there are going to be violations of emotional intimacy and different
Yeah.
aspects of the relationship with your spouse. And so it needs to be brought to the forefront, and you need to address that and be mindful of that and honor your relationship first and foremost.
Yes. I do a lot of work with churches and missions organizations. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I do that. But I run into a lot of issues where people in positions of leadership who value marriage as sacred, they're getting coffee with if it's like a male pastor, they're getting coffee with a random female in the church, and it's like, guys, ladies, you can't with men. It's like what you don't understand are the small nuances that can get crossed that move you in a particular direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mel and I, like, I don't meet with females
Mm-hmm.
for coffee dates just to hang out. We just don't do it. Same thing with Mel. If I'm meeting with a female for any related reason, my wife knows about it.
Yep.
And it's very specific. I update her afterwards, and that's part of our ethic, our marriage ethic, and you have to be intentional about it. And yeah, so many conversations to get into that, but I really appreciate you saying that. Anyway, what were you gonna say?
Well, I work with mostly men, like I told you. And so interestingly, well, it was such a lovely experience. My men's group, so I have a men's coaching group, and 9 of the gentlemen came here to Scottsdale for an informal meetup. And Dennis, my partner, he came and he met everybody and all that. But then there were times when I said, hey, I'm going to go meet with so-and-so, and so we're going to go get a coffee, have a walk. But it is in this frame of, right? And
Yeah.
they communicate respect to Dennis, and he knows about it. And then, I debrief with him afterwards. And that's how you preserve your commitment to your relationship.
100%. And so much of that is even having the conversation with your partner, your spouse about this fosters connection.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, hey, you trust me enough to have these conversations. We want to set these boundaries. I think it's really, really meaningful. We don't have to get a ton into this right now, but because I want to ask you a couple questions about marriage. I don't even know how long we've been going, but let's just touch briefly on masculinity and femininity. And to be clear, I'm not talking about the gender discussions right now in terms of transgender identities. That's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about masculinity, femininity, how they connect to conversations in relationships about gender roles. What are some of your thoughts about that and how it's connected?
Well, this comes up a lot. I mean, it's embedded in everything, and I definitely, it's one of my main themes that I probably talk about, and it's related to integration, because people have this misinformed idea that it's like a binary, that men should be 100% masculine and women should be 100% feminine, because they see it as tied to gender or sex, and it's not. It's more of a metaphysical thing, like an energy, right? And it's on a spectrum. And so we have to understand that each of us, if you wanted to categorize masculine things about us or feminine things about us, we're going to have both. And so when we're integrated, we find this equilibrium, I call it the sweet spot of being not resistant to one or the other and not being overly emphasizing one that is like, if you're a woman and you're heterosexual, you don't want to be too masculine. And if you're a man and you're heterosexual, you don't want to be too feminine. And there's a lot of factors environmentally and culturally
Right.
that will influence you towards skewing your energy in one direction or the other. And a lot of times it's unconscious. And so when you, even if we talk about hormone balancing, right, on a physiological level, like our hormones are so out of whack. And this plays into it. And so, being so self-aware and doing the reflection to really understand when you're feeling off, like dysregulated, this is also involved. Like maybe I'm doing way too much masculine centered activities that my energy is skewed towards the masculine as a woman, or vice versa. And I encourage, whether you're a man or a woman, to have the right sort of balance of, I also call it yin and yang
Yeah.
activities, because so yin is the feminine side and the yang is the masculine side. And so we need, like, men need to do the sort of leisure, and they need to do the meditation and prayer and whatever is the right sort of process oriented activity versus goal oriented activity, right? That
Yeah.
yang is the goal oriented directional activity that is very active and constructive, versus the more feminine, which is a little bit more passive or receptive and sitting back and being and not doing as much. So we need to do both.
Yeah. Man, we could maybe we'll do a podcast on this too. It just kind of lean into what are the qualities of the masculine and the qualities of the feminine, and how do they really integrate? Because I'm open about my own faith journey as a psychologist, as someone that identifies as a Christ follower, and I know not everybody watching this identifies even as a spiritual person. But it's fascinating to me because creation. So for my faith people out there who are kind of watching this, even what you're talking about, creation originally designed things. There was an intentionality there, and in God, there's the full integration of masculine and feminine. And when he put the masculine into the male and the feminine into the female, one was not greater and one was not lesser. They were roles assigned that represented aspects of his character, both in the masculine and in the feminine. And they were meant to work together, complement each other, bring the best out of each other. And I do believe that both had the freedom to display qualities of the other, but just represented aspects of who God is, and as they put that into his creation. And so as you're talking about it, when I first heard you talk about it, it resonated with me, not just as a psychologist, but as a person of faith, to go, yeah, this isn't about, because everything gets couched with the idea of sexism, but any form of ism, like racism, etc., connotes this idea that I want to shut down the person who holds that quality. And to talk about gender differences, to talk about the masculine, the feminine, how that manifests in complementary flourishing, isn't sexist at all. It just acknowledges the reality of who we are as a species.
And how we fit together.
And how we fit and flourish together. And it doesn't mean that everybody lines up with those things. And we get that. Like there's no judgment there coming from us regarding that. But as a species, to be able to have this conversation in a meaningful way, I think is really important.
And we have to acknowledge that there's a difference between shutting someone down and creating limitations and boundaries, because people get confused, right? And so feel limited in their behavior. A lot of people will get defensive and lash out, assuming that that's some kind of offense or attack, right? So I think obviously their feelings are valid, but their interpretation of your intention is obviously not, right? You're not trying to judge or discredit them, but just saying there are certain boundaries that we need to acknowledge, because limitations allow us to function in a healthy way.
I cut you. I'm sorry. Keep going. Say that again. Limitations allow us what?
To function in a healthy way. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my God. to the idea that boundaries are evil, that limitations or roles have somehow, and I realize that they have been used against people groups. That's not the argument that we're making right now. But so if there's a coin and freedom is on one side of that coin, responsibility is on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And to the degree that you don't take ownership for your life, set healthy boundaries, that is the degree to which you are actually in bondage to hedonism.
That's right.
And I'm with you. Okay, so thank you. We can talk more about details, in future conversations about that. But it has a role in partnerships and in marriages and how we vet people and think about long-term relationships. You mentioned this a little bit. What do you think traditional marriage therapy tends to get wrong sometimes? And what insights do couples need to really flourish?
Okay, I'll try not to get too long-winded with this one, but I think a lot of it is that the emphasis on the woman, right? When you go into a marriage therapy office, generally, I think most men assume they're going to be shut down, right? They're not going to be heard, and they're not going to be advocated for, and oftentimes that ends up to be the case, unfortunately, because again, some of the premise of the theoretical models does tend to have a bias towards women. And so, and this again, you want to learn how to be emotionally intelligent, and you want to learn emotional regulation, and that could be seen as a feminine endeavor. But at the same time, stoicism and a man who can stay composed emotionally under stress, like, this is a very masculine quality. Women are the more emotionally volatile creatures, and men are the more emotionally regulated creatures. So I think it's important for us to recognize that women are not necessarily the more emotionally advanced.
Yeah.
So when you go into therapy, I think that is not communicated, that men are not valued in that way for their composure, that they're encouraged to emote like women. And that's not creating solutions for men. They should be working on finding that integration point of how almost to interpret between the feminine communication styles and the masculine communication styles, and valuing both, kind of like love languages. Similar to that, paralleling that, because they don't really often talk about this when the idea of love languages comes up. But has there been research on whether there are like gender trends? Because I'm pretty sure that males will have specific love languages and women have, others more frequently, because it does kind of fall under a gender specific designation. I think men want more physical touch, and they want more acts of service, and women will want more words of affirmation. Now, of course, there's going to be variation, but I think generally there are more masculine expressions of love and feminine expressions of love, and we focus heavily on the feminine expressions of love being more, gushy and romantic and all of that, whereas men usually communicate love through duty, through doing things for them. And it's not necessarily acknowledged, or even people don't even really notice it sometimes, like how a man expresses his love. He's forced to express it like a woman in order for a woman to receive it. And I think that's unfair and unbalanced.
I appreciate you saying that. I think psychology as a whole, psychology and counseling, because they have tended towards, and again, we're not knocking feminism, right? It's not but this radical ideology of bring down the patriarchy, while there are good points to that, it has infiltrated therapy. And I think instead of focusing on fostering both parties' voices in the marriage, it's focused so much on what you just described that it actually sabotages the process. Does does that make sense to you? I'm open to feedback on that, but
I think there are bad faith actors and good faith actors, right, on both sides.
yeah,
And the emphasis has been on the bad actors of the patriarchy, the
yeah,
men who have misused their power and authority and taken control, victimized women. And every time I bring up age gaps, I mean, it's incredible that the amount of backlash I get because people assume all older men are predators.
mm,
Like they really believe there's no room for nuance here. There's no room for a healthy, well-intended, good faith older man to be courting or vetting or dating a younger woman. Now, of course, there are going to be times when it is exploitive, but that's not always the case. And you have to take it on a case by case basis and look at the health of the connection and the health of the people involved. If they are well adjusted and they're self-aware and they're accountable and they have an authentic, genuine connection based on shared values, even
yeah,
if you don't have like the same, you're from different generations and some of your interests are different, like we talked about before, you can still share the core values and align on those things that are important and just have really good communication with each other that you're able to sustain a healthy relationship despite the age gap.
yeah. That's great. I one more thought about the marriage piece, and I got one or two more questions, and we'll be done for this go round of everything. But uh, I think one of the things in marriage counseling, if you're in marriage counseling, build the skills, do all the things that you need to be doing. If you're in pre-marriage work, do all those skills. If you're in that vetting, do all those skills. But one of the things you want to pay attention to is what you really believe at a core level about the opposite sex and what you particularly believe about your partner. Because if there's something in you that believes my partner is not for me, it will sabotage all of the work that you do. And that gets back to attachment styles, internal working models about how relationships work. And so it's just more of a statement. I'm open to feedback on that, but paying attention to those internal belief systems and fostering aware, it goes back to self-leadership.
And could I add like another thought?
Yeah.
I just think a lot of people are so embarrassed or insecure about acknowledging their own faults or idiosyncrasies, right? It's maybe not like something wrong with you, but it's just a fact. For instance, I call them trade-offs. So let's say maybe you're an older woman and you're single, and so it feeds into their own mental health because they're insecure and they have this scarcity mindset, like they need to settle for less because they're getting old, so they're just going to take someone like that's decent as a partner to settle down with, right? And so it's important to know, one, it's never too late to find the right person, so don't let that scarcity overwhelm you. But two, also defensive about your trade-offs, about your flaws or shortcomings, whatever you're bringing to the table, because the more you run from it, the more problems you're going to attract in a partner,
Uh,
right?
uh,
You can be humble enough to say, I know I'm past my prime, maybe I'm 40 and I'm single, and so I can't promise you children of my own, right? But you have to be able to acknowledge that and talk about it if you're serious with someone that
mhm.
you've connected. And a lot of people are just denying it and they're obscuring it because it makes them so insecure. And that's how,
Yep.
because then they attach to the wrong people.
Yeah, that's so good. So how, um, are you okay on time? I got two more questions.
Sure, sure.
You doing okay? Um, and then I want you to tell us about what you do and how people can connect with you. I want to be sure there's some actionable steps there. But how you've already answered some of this actually. How do we minimize divorce and maximize marital success? It's the vetting.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. There you go. We'll tell you about that in a minute.
Here's some interesting, I think they're interesting facts. So, we've all heard like 50% of divorce or marriages end in divorce, but this is the lifetime rate of divorce. The actual yearly rate of divorce is going down. So 14 out of 1,000 marriages are ending in divorce per year. So
Wow.
the rate clearly is going down and the rate of marriage is going down. But don't be alarmed. Like I said before, that's actually a good thing. You want less marriages to happen because you don't want the wrong people getting married, like rushing to
Yeah.
the altar, because those are the ones that are going to get divorced.
Yep.
So by the time this rate gets updated, we'll probably see, like, the trend is happening. So we'll probably see that the divorce rate is going to be like 45% and 40% as we go on in this direction, because we're already seeing that the rate is around 30% if you contextualize it, take out some variables, right, and adjust it for certain controls. So, whether your education level or your culture, your faith, a lot of first-time marriages have a better rate, right? Like they say that the rate is closer to about 30% than 50%. So I want to encourage people that as bad as it is, and as you don't want to end up going through divorce court, because the laws are definitely unfair towards women's benefit and against men. But it doesn't necessarily have to happen to you. So a lot of people are avoiding marriage or prolonging, relationships like without getting married because they're afraid of getting married. But if you vet, you are putting yourself in the positive part of that equation, that statistic.
Yeah.
As long as you are consciously picking the right people, then you have a much better likelihood of marital success. So don't let that deter you. Just let that motivate you to work really hard in the front end of finding the right person,
Yeah.
so that you don't have to, cure it later, like a bad marriage later on. Prevent it.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because one of the questions I had for you is how do we help failing marriages? And one of the things that we do at our practice, and even from a coaching perspective, is therapeutic separations. And
Oh.
and it's a very structured approach. And I forget the actual numbers, but well over 75% of couples that do structured therapeutic separations actually stay married. And
Yes.
one of the reasons for that is that therapeutic separations aren't counseling, it's an intervention, and it helps people find their own voice to be able to do the things that you've been talking about, that while we may wish that we would have done on the front end, as soon as you're aware of it, just start doing it now.
Yeah.
But do you have any thoughts about how we help people when they feel like they're in a marriage that's failing?
Well, I love what you're doing. That's awesome to hear. I'm really happy that that's happening. But when you are, it's, whatever the case may be, right? Like it could be so many different things, because infidelity is obviously something that's very emotionally charged, and it's hard to repair after something like that. But it is possible. On a grand scheme, you just have to have both parties' commitment to accountability and healthy communication, and to be open and flexible and agreeable to prioritize this commitment that you have for each other. I'm not saying you should always stay married. To be transparent, I have been divorced in the past before I applied all of this knowledge. Now I know better. So I am not sanctimonious about that. Like, if you are in the wrong marriage and two people are not committed to change, then it cannot work. And so you do need to focus on separating therapeutically. But you can make it work if both parties are willing to confront the issues and do the work in order to make it better.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say, so much of this comes back to what happens in people's lives as they're working with you, as they're vetting. So much of that is their own self-work. And so even in marriages that feel like they're failing, get back into the self-work first. Get a voice, maybe consider like a formal therapeutic separation. You can probably find somebody in your area that does these. And then as that happens, walk through that intervention, and then hit a reset button on what some of those things can look like. And if both people are committed to that process, there's a real possibility possibility that it can work. Okay.
Yeah.
Taylor, thank you. I really appreciate this conversation. I love talking to you. Tell everybody, like, so how do they get connected to you? Like, what are the key areas? What are you offering where they can jump in and work with you, team, whatever?
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of different options. On Instagram, I do have an Instagram subscription. I know yours is kicking off too and doing really well. And I enjoy it. I call it micro group coaching.
Yep.
So I have 53 subscribers and I separate them into a women's chat group and a men's chat group. And then we have another chat group for single and vetting people, co-ed. So it's a place for us to really process and debrief on learning the vetting system and applying it, but also potentially matching amongst the subscribers. So I've had some success in connecting people in my online community and Instagram, and also my one-to-one coaching clients. So some of them have gotten married, have had babies, have gotten engaged.
That's awesome.
And that's really, I love that work. But Instagram is definitely a good place to connect with me on the lower level, which is, it's only like $5 a month for that. But I also have a book that explains how to use social media for vetting and connecting with your ideal partner.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's also a great thing to get. And yeah, then they can always get a free call and a vetting call from me, and we can touch base and I can help them decide what would be the best next step for them.
Perfect. So really, I know you're watching this on Instagram. Follow you on Instagram, and just you can dive in from there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy. I focus on quality over quantity and being available to people as much as possible, and really connecting to my community, because I vet my community, and then I use my connections with my community to help them vet their matches. Yeah. So I have to.
So well, I'm glad I made that cut.
Yeah. Well, we have the Louisiana connection too, so that's awesome.
Say what?
I school in New Orleans.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. We go Tigers. LSU. Sorry. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I would love to, in the near future, do another one. And I'd love for you to come on our podcast when we launch it, My Well Lab, and we're rocking and rolling.
For having me.
Yeah.
It's been
Awesome. Well, so I don't know how to turn this off.
I think.
Button, and we're good?
Yep,
That's
should
perfect.
be good.
All right. We'll
Bye.
see. Thank you, Taylor. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.